But we begin this morning with the cleanup of material that was dumped at a park in Islip on Long Island. Last year, as you may recall, residents were stunned to learn that improper fill had been dumped at Roberto Clemente Park and several other nearby sites. Prosecutors even brought charges against several contractors, companies, and a former town parks commissioner.
Some unscrupulous individuals believe that they can just go into the town of Islip and dump toxic and hazardous materials without any consequences at all.
Now, the dumping forced the park's closure, and it is delayed by a couple of years the town's plan to modernize that park. And while court action proceeds ahead, in fact, it begins tomorrow, there is some good news, though, about Roberto Clemente Park. And here to explain that is Glenn Neuschwender, president of Enviroscience Consultants. They are the company that was hired to clean up the park. And welcome to the show, Mr. Neuschwender.
Thank you, Richard.
So you've completely cleaned up the park now?
We have. We got it all.
You got it all. Yeah, that was a headline in one of the papers. How long did it take to clean it up?
The entire process from the time the state approved the work plan until it was completed took about 8 months.
State Department of Environmental Conservation, DEC, has overseen this as well. Have they signed off on your cleanup?
They have. They're waiting for our submission of the final report of all of the activities that were performed on the site, but yeah, that should be a formality.
Now, I remember as a reporter, you know, the claims and the allegations were kind of all over the map as to what was in that park and people's concerns about it. Some very, very upset and worried that there was a tremendous health threat and that some of these materials might be carcinogens and other chemicals that would be very harmful to one's health. What did you find dumped inside the park and where?
Sure. So let's go back to the spring of last year where we were retained by the district attorney's office to conduct an investigation into the material that was placed in the park. At that time, we sampled about 30 or so different locations throughout both the former soccer field and the recharge basin. And we found a suite of contaminants that included semi-volatile organic compounds, metals, pesticides, and non-friable asbestos. What is
a semi-volatile organic compound?
Sure, these are compounds that either occur naturally or are man-made, have a low boiling point, and some of them are known to be carcinogens.
How would you characterize this stuff? I mean, is it basically construction material that usually gets dumped at special sites where construction material is supposed to be sent?
Exactly. Much of the material had been demolition material from buildings, as I understand it, located within New York City. Those buildings were potentially contaminated with the materials that had been used in those buildings and then were disposed of at the park.
Did you find any evidence of asbestos? Was there any metal or glass there?
Sure. So we found a good deal of non-friable asbestos throughout the entire park's soccer field and recharge basin complex, as well as individual locations of metals like barium, chromium, lead.
And glass?
And glass, yeah.
Well, see, that's the thing that shocks people, and that's not your domain. That's what prosecutors are working on, because this is a park for kids and soccer fields, so people can't understand why that would happen. From your cleaning up, though, and working with the district attorney's office, were you unable to any way to connect where this dumped material had come from originally?
That wasn't our charge, so I can't say that where it came from except what I heard from the investigators in the DA's office.
So now what did you do with the material that you scooped up from in there?
Sure, so we sampled and we came up with what we understand to be a complete assessment of the materials, a characterization, if you will. We compiled a report for both the district attorney's office, and then when it came time to begin the cleanup process, we were retained by the town of Islip to write a remediation protocol.
Was there any sense that the asbestos was a threat? Because I know when it gets airborne, it can get into your lungs, and then it becomes a real health threat.
Sure. So almost from the beginning, the material was wetted consistently by the town on a daily basis to ensure that particulates were not allowed to become airborne. The material that was found as far as asbestos goes was non-friable, meaning that it doesn't release fibers easily. And so the risk from that material to the surrounding neighborhood was fairly low.
Okay, so now Tuesday reported, though, that there was some contamination, although it apparently fell below some standards called safe levels for residential properties, which is apparently different from parks. Can you explain that for us?
Sure. So the guidelines that the samples were compared to were the DEC's unrestricted residential use guidelines, and those were found to be below those levels, and that was...
Now, there was some samples that showed benzoatrazine. That's a hydrocarbon that is a suspected carcinogen. Do we know where that came from?
We don't. And so you're now talking about the sampling that was performed at the end of the project. And we took about 25 different endpoint samples. Those samples included an assessment of about 200 different parameters in each sample. And in one case, we had an exceedance that was slightly above the regulatory
Do we
standard.
know what caused that or where that came from?
No.
And then there was some concern also about the Suffolk legislature had approved drilling test wells there to make sure that the groundwater was not contaminated. And I understand that there were some higher levels of pesticides that were found in their wells. Do we know where that came from? Did it come from this construction dumping?
The Suffolk County Department of Health believes that that contamination is off-site.
So still some questions remain as to where some of this stuff came from. Could have been from other sources, and that's for all the investigators to figure out. As for your company, though, that was hired to clean this up, is your work done now? Is that park safe?
So we're in a transition for where we move from the material having been removed and the DEC signing off on it to working with the town of Islip. Supervisor Carpenter is looking to now take the park into a restoration phase, if you will, where the soccer fields will be restored and the additional improvements to the park made.
Well, people there are certainly looking forward to that. That's been held up for a couple of years, and it looks like it's going to be a couple more years before it can actually be returned to what its original intent was. But Glenn Neuschwender, your company cleaned it up. The community thanks you for that. President of Enviroscience Consultants, thanks for coming in and explaining these results for us.
Thanks for having me.